It was 03:17 hours on the morning of November 4th, 1951, and the hills above the Imjin River were alive with a kind of cold that doesn't just bite. It reaches inside a man and takes something he doesn't get back. The temperature had dropped to minus 14 degrees Celsius, somewhere north of the 38th parallel, in a stretch of fractured ridgeline that the maps called Hill 355, but that the men who bled on it called Little Gibraltar. The stars were the only light that night, and even they seemed reluctant, half buried behind a moving curtain of cloud that rolled in from Manchuria, carrying the promise of more snow. In the valley below, 3 platoons of the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the PPCLI, were dug into fighting positions they had scraped out of frozen ground with entrenching tools and their bare hands. They had been there since October 23rd. They intended to stay. 12 kilometers to the east, in a forward command post that smelled of diesel and unwashed wool, Major Harold Denton of the United States Army's 7th Infantry Regiment was staring at a field telephone like it owed him something. He was 34 years old, a graduate of West Point, a veteran of the Pusan perimeter and the nightmare retreat from the Chosin Reservoir the previous winter. He had seen men die in ways that made theology complicated. But what was happening to his soldiers right now, on the slopes above Mariang San, was something different. It was systematic, it was patient, and it was working. 2 companies of Denton's battalion had moved up through a draw at last light, following intelligence that suggested a weakened Chinese position. The intelligence was wrong, or it had been right 4 hours ago and was catastrophically wrong now. By 12:45 hours, the lead elements of Baker Company had walked into a Chinese envelopment so precisely coordinated that veterans of the engagement would later describe it as textbook. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army had mastered the art of allowing an enemy force to enter a position before closing the ring behind them. And on this night, against these men, they executed it with terrible efficiency. Baker Company was trapped. Charlie Company, attempting to reinforce, had been stopped cold by interlocking fire from 2 ridgelines and had gone to ground in a shallow ravine that offered cover but no exit. Denton's radio man counted 47 men unaccounted for. 47 Americans in the dark, in the cold, inside a Chinese perimeter. And the major commanding their rescue had run out of American options. What Harold Denton did next was, by his own later admission in a debriefing document dated November 19th, 1951, the hardest thing he had ever done in uniform. He picked up a different radio handset, asked for a different frequency, and made a request that crossed not just unit boundaries, but something older and more complicated, the quiet, unspoken hierarchy of national military pride. He asked the Canadians for help. To understand what that moment meant, you have to understand what the Canadians had become in Korea by the autumn of 1951. They had arrived the previous year as part of the 25th Canadian Infantry Brigade, operating within the Commonwealth Division, and they had immediately distinguished themselves in a way that surprised even their closest allies. At Kapyong, in April of 1951, the 2nd PPCLI had stood against an overwhelming Chinese assault and held a position that, had it fallen, would have left the road to Seoul open. They had been outnumbered. They had called artillery down on their own positions. They had held. For that action, the battalion received the United States Presidential Unit Citation, one of the very few times in American military history that a foreign unit was so honored. Word travels in armies. By the time the fighting moved north toward the Kansas line and the hills above the Imjin, the Chinese knew the Canadians by reputation. More importantly, so did the Americans. There was something in the Canadian soldier of that era that defied easy categorization. They were not louder than the Americans, nor more heavily equipped, nor faster, nor larger. What they possessed was a quality that their officers called steadiness, and that their enemies called, in captured documents translated by Commonwealth intelligence officers and filed in Tokchon on November 2nd, 1951, something closer to soldiers who do not leave. Interrogated Chinese prisoners, speaking through interpreters in forward holding areas near Yongchon, consistently described the Commonwealth positions as the ones they preferred to avoid. When asked specifically about the Canadians, one prisoner, a company commander of the 191st Division, said through an interpreter that his men believed the Canadians fought as though they had nothing waiting for them at home. It was not entirely a compliment, but it was entirely a measure of fear. Major Denton's radio call reached the command post of Lieutenant Colonel Jim Stone at 03:22 hours. Stone was a man of very few words, which was itself a form of language. He listened to the American situation report without interrupting. When Denton finished, there was a silence of 4 seconds, long enough that the radio man on the American end later said he thought the connection had dropped. Then Stone's voice came back, flat and measured, with the particular cadence of a man doing arithmetic in his head. He said he understood the situation. He said he would call back in 6 minutes. Stone spent those 6 minutes doing what commanders do in the dark, calculating the cost of action against the cost of inaction, weighing his own men against another nation's soldiers, thinking about corridors and ridge lines and the likely position of Chinese reserves. At 03:28 hours, he called Denton back. He had a proposition. He would send 2 companies, Dog and Easy, on a flanking approach from the northwest, which would require them to cross approximately 2 kilometers of open ridgeline in darkness, with no fire support, until they reached a point close enough to the Chinese position that artillery would become dangerous to the men they were trying to rescue. His soldiers would go in with cold steel and grenades, if it came to that. The price of this proposition was not money. It was that Denton's available artillery would shift its fires to a blocking position on the eastern side of the draw to prevent Chinese reinforcement. Denton agreed in under 10 seconds. At 03:41 hours, Dog and Easy companies of the 2nd PPCLI began moving northeast through a landscape that would have stopped most men before they started. The temperature had fallen another 2 degrees. The ground was frozen iron overlaid with a thin crust of ice that broke underfoot with a sound like cracking glass. And every section commander in both companies spent those first minutes of movement hissing at his men to slow down, to place their feet more carefully, to breathe through their noses instead of their mouths. Sound discipline at night is the difference between an assault and a massacre, and these men knew it. They had learned it in training at Fort Lewis and Currie Barracks, refined it in the hills above the Imjin, paid for the lessons they hadn't learned quickly enough with names on casualty lists. Corporal Raymond Terre of 7th Platoon Dog Company, a 22-year-old from Saint-Lin, Quebec, who'd enlisted in the army because his father told him it would make a man of him, and who had privately concluded his father was right but would never say so, later described the movement in a letter to his brother Marcel, postmarked Poussin, November 28, 1951. He wrote that the ridgeline they crossed was the loneliest place he had ever been in his life, and that the stars went in and out of the clouds, and that every time the clouds covered them, the darkness became the kind of darkness that has weight. He wrote that nobody talked. He wrote that he could hear his own heart, and was fairly certain that everyone else could too. They reached the first Chinese outpost at 0447 hours. The outpost consisted of 4 soldiers in a scraped position behind a low stone wall, and the section that found them did so by nearly walking into them. What happened in the next 40 seconds was close and violent and very quiet, which is its own kind of horror. The outpost was neutralized without firearms. The Chinese position inside the perimeter, approximately 300 meters further east, did not receive a warning. Dog Company swung south. Easy Company continued east, moving parallel to the draw, and it was Easy's lead platoon that first made contact with the trapped Americans at 0512 hours. Private First-Class Baker Company soldiers, exhausted, frostbitten, several of them wounded, all of them convinced they had been forgotten, heard footsteps approaching their position and prepared for a final engagement